When I write, I often look for a central image. For this input today, I came up with the idea of comparing the European Union and its member states to a power plug. This was the image I had in my mind. Travel anywhere in Europe nowadays and you'll notice it. The great continent of shared values and one market still can't agree on a single plug. Each country has its own socket, its own idea of how things should connect. It's a small thing, but it says a lot. In Europe, the current is there: economic power, cultural depth, political ideals. What's missing, in my opinion, is a system that channels this energy coherently, a federal structure that allows Europe to plug in and actually work as one. And here, the idea of a federal Europe could make sense. A federal Europe would be the new circuit, so to say, through which this energy can run. And a model already exists. Switzerland, with its federal system and 26 cantons, is in many ways a mini EU. European countries should take this model as a guide, or can take it as a guide, and reform the European Union. Centralize in certain areas and decentralize in others. European states gave rise to one of the most important culture and socio-political movements in Western civilization with the Enlightenment of the 18th century. From sapere audes, call to have the courage to use your own mind, the idea arose in Europe that values, ideals and rights such as human dignity and human rights, freedom and self-determination and independence are universal in nature. This continues to shape the Western and especially European worldview and self-image to this day. But it is under external and internal pressure now. An external factor, of course, is Russia's questioning of the European security order. The Russian Federation is working together with its partner China on a new, in their words, polycentric world order. And then the internal pressure, on the other hand, comes from fundamentalist groups in Europe. I think here of Islamic groups as well as ideologies such as postmodern deconstructionists who contribute to the discrediting of the European way of life. Conservatives often blame the European Union for these problems. Some are calling for a return to the European model of nation-states. In my view, this would be wrong. The nation-states in Europe can no longer solve global and domestic challenges on their own. In the current situation, I see a federally organized Europe as a solution. This does not mean the formation of a European superstate, but rather a federation modeled on Switzerland. The idea of a federal Europe is also not a new one. As early as the 19th century, for example, Victor Hugo, the French writer, spoke of the idea of a United States of Europe. These ideas have also been thought through in relation to defense, which is also relevant in the context today. In 1966, for example, the German politician and later minister of Bavaria, Franz Josef Strauss, outlined in his book Entwurf für Europa in German, in English translated it means Draft for Europe. There he laid out a plan to deepen European cooperation, particularly in foreign and security policy, as, in his words, as a strategy for overcoming global political challenges. And his idea was to create a United States of Europe, which would also include the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. The United Europe was to rank as an independent third force between the United States and then, it was during the time of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And securing in between these two power blocks a position of free societies. That was the idea of Strauss. And I find Strauss' idea interesting because, once again, the question of how to position European states as a power bloc is at the forefront, whether we are facing a new Cold War, between the United States and China in a so-called bifurcated world, or as I mentioned, polycentric world order, it is clear that European states can only assert themselves through greater internal unity. Of course, one could argue that the EU, with its 27 member states, is in a good economic position. I mean, compared to historical standards, at least. It has a GDP of 19 trillion and a signal market of 450 million people. In fact, it is an economic giant. But geopolitically, I would argue it is a dwarf. But we do not have to accept the current institutional weakness of the European Union as God-given. As historian Brendan Stims argues, historical records show that successful unions have oftentimes emerged not through evolution but through a Big Bang. Europe has experienced, we can say, several such Big Bang moments in the last months. So why not think boldly now? I think it is useful to understand the concept of federal Europe if we go back in time. At the beginning, the European Union was primarily an alliance for economic cooperation in Europe. In 1951, 6 countries established the European Coal and Steel Community, in short ECSC. In the following decades, the community grew through several rounds of enlargement and deepened its cooperation. For example, through the 1985 Schengen Agreement, which opened internal borders. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 officially established the European Union and gave it new powers in important policy areas. Subsequent reform treaties, most recently the Treaty of Lisbon of 2007, strengthened the EU's supranational powers and consolidated its democratic legitimacy, in particular by enhancing the role of the European Parliament. The European Union's institutional system is based on a combination of supranational and intergovernmental elements. The European Commission represents the Union's common interests by proposing legislation and overseeing its implementation. Legislative authority is shared between the Council of the European Union, representing the Member States, and the European Parliament, representing citizens directly. The European Council sets the Union's strategic direction, and the European Court of Justice ensures that uniform application of EU law, complementing this structure. This architecture already features elements of a federal system, such as the separation of powers, multi-level governance, and a balance between community and national competences. Still, the EU remains oftentimes weak in key areas, such as defense, foreign policy, and also asylum policy. And Switzerland offers an instructive contrast. It shows that political diversity does not have to hinder collective action if it is institutionally embedded. Its federal system originated from historical conflict. The 1847 Civil War made it clear that unity could not be enforced, but rather had to be based on compromise. The 1848 Federal Constitution then established a federation that centralizes responsibilities according to the principle of subsidiarity. This makes the Swiss system extremely stable and efficient. The Swiss model is interesting for Europe because it took cultural differences between the cantons into account, thereby preventing centralization. The Swiss federal model is based on the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, this means that tasks should be carried out at the lowest possible level by the unit closest to citizens and with the greatest degree of autonomy, and that higher levels only intervene if subordinate bodies are unable to fulfill their responsibilities. Each canton in Switzerland has its own constitution, government and parliament, allowing it to tailor laws and policies to local needs. This keeps decision-making close to citizens. In many respects, each canton functions, we can say, as a small state within a larger union with its own rules and identity. This means that personal responsibility is encouraged and government assistance is only provided as subsidiarity support when individual or community self-help is insufficient. The federation also united 4 national languages and diverse regional identities, from the German-speaking cantons to the French and Italian-speaking ones. In Switzerland, at the top of the hierarchy of this federation stands the federal constitution, which defines how the national government works, sets the boundaries between the federal government and the cantons, and protects the rights of citizens. The executive branch of the Federal Council is a 7-member body that collectively acts as the government of Switzerland. And from these ministers, one of them each year in a rotation takes on the task of the president. We call it the principle of primus inter pares, and he then leads the communication to the outside. Then the legislative branch, the Federal Assembly, is divided into 2 chambers, the National Council and the Council of States. The National Council represents the people with seats allocated according to population, while the Council of States represents the cantons with 2 representatives per canton. For a law to be passed, both chambers must agree, ensuring a balance between the interests of the citizens and the cantons. There is a third level, of course, the municipalities, but I won't go into detail here about that. Power is clearly divided in Switzerland. The federal government is responsible for foreign policy, defense and trade issues, for example, while the cantons are responsible for education, for example, healthcare and policing. This balance makes sure that federation is united on important issues while preserving local autonomy. And some of you might flinch at the thought of a federal Europe. Often the fear of bureaucratization and centralization in all areas is associated with this idea. But I think the Swiss model shows very well that there is another way. If you allow federal structures in some important areas, but also decentralize in others. The EU currently has 2 legislative bodies, the directly elected European Parliament and the Council of the EU, which consists of national ministers. Under a Swiss-style model, the EU Parliament would evolve into 2 chambers. The first would resemble the Swiss National Council. It would represent citizens directly with seats allocated according to the population size. The second chamber would mirror the Council of States. Each member state, regardless of size, would elect 2 representatives to ensure equal representation. Legislation would only become binding once approved by both chambers, meaning decisions would reflect the interests of both the population and the states. And this dual legitimacy would, in my opinion, reduce the sense of political disconnection that many member states feel toward Brussels. A European Federal Council based on the Swiss model could replace the current Commission, which is led by a single individual. This 7-member body would be elected by the European Parliament and cover the most important policy areas, like in Switzerland, Federal Council. So, for example, foreign policy, defense, the economy and finance, and energy. The presidency of this council could also rotate annually. This would create a balance between the members and establish, I think, a culture of shared responsibility. No single country or office would dominate the union. Instead, collegiality would be at the heart of decision making. Decisions would have to be made jointly, promoting stability and continuity. At the national or regional level, responsibility would lie with the individual countries for areas such as education, health, social policy, and taxation, where local ownership are important. When it comes to direct democracy, I am somewhat cautious. I support it in Switzerland, where it has led to a high level of satisfaction and political stability. But it also requires an understanding of it among the population and the political class. This is the case in Switzerland. For example, the Swiss electorate has already rejected additional holidays in referendums as to not make the Swiss industrial sector less competitive. It is questionable whether populations without a culture of direct democracy would also take on this responsibility. Therefore, in a federal Europe, I would not introduce direct democracy. There are, of course, objections to the idea of a federal EU modeled on Switzerland. Some may argue that Switzerland is small and historically unique, and that it functions so well as a federation thanks to its direct democracy. But I would counter here this objection by saying, look across the Atlantic. There you will find Switzerland's so-called sister republic also organized as a federation. And it is reasonably successful as a world power at the moment. My idea of a federal Europe is not one of centralization and bureaucratization, but rather targeted cooperation at EU level where appropriate, alongside decentralization where nation states are better placed to make decisions. This could be modeled on Switzerland, where the cantons take on a great deal of responsibility and account for around 39% of public spending. Another objection could be that the current member states of the EU would never give up their own sovereignty. That would undoubtedly be a radical step. However, the advantages could be so great in the future that these countries decide to take this step. Switzerland has been showing since 1848 that this can work very successfully. A final objection is that a federal Europe would further distance citizens from politics. This is precisely why the Swiss model is so relevant. As an example, it unites diverse cultures and languages within a single entity. When the European Council launched the Convention in December 2001, it aimed to achieve a constitution for the Union that would bring logic to institutional design and a viable federal structure. But the resulting draft, the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe of June and October 2004, fell short, and we observed there that it lacked the federal state logic that would make a true constitution. And according to Chatham House, it reflected no major expansion of EU competences and retaining the existing institutional shell. If Europe now needs clarity, logic, and federal structure, then those omitted elements of the 2001 and 2004 process remain unfinished business. The foundations are there. What's missing is the current that ties them together. Europe needs to reconnect. A federal structure would act as the main circuit, channeling power through common institutions while keeping national autonomy intact. Thank you very much for listening. This is Yannick Scheidecker, and until next week, stay informed and stay geopolitically correct.